Hi, everybody. My name is Paul Bockelman. I'm Senior Solutions Architect in our public sector. Been working a lot of different interesting use cases since joining public sector at AWS. So when I was approached for the opportunity to work with the disaster response team, I jumped at it because it's a great opportunity to take a look at working with a lot of the different services and use cases and customers and different capabilities and requirements that I've encountered with some of my customers over the years. And so what we're going to talk about here, from the abstract perspective, if you've looked at the app and the reason why you're sitting here, something here interests you, I just want to revisit kind of a couple things here. During a disaster, and when a disaster happens, and we know this is pretty devastating, especially if we look at what happened with Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands last year, speed and timeliness of response is critical, especially when you're talking about saving people's lives. So I want to touch on how we can help improve speed of the disaster response. We're also looking at how AWS is putting together the disaster response program to be able to support humanitarian relief organizations, NPOs, potentially even governments, and even local authorities. So how can we do this? And last, what I want to do is I want to challenge all of you in the room. Let's think about the art of the possible. I'm not here to pitch a service that's shrink-wrapped and you just go into console, click this button, and all of a sudden you now have disaster response enabled. That's not what the purpose of this is. The purpose of this talk really is to introduce you to the concept and the program that we're launching. As AWS, we're launching this for the global customer base. But more importantly, I want you to think about looking at some of the native services that we have and say, oh, wow, I didn't think about using it that way. And so Amazon, when we talk about Amazon support to date, it started to hit the news and became very vocal, or visible rather, when we see our response for hurricanes Harvey, Maria, and a few others with Prime and Prime Air, delivering disaster relief supplies, medicines, water, response kits, whatever it is. Amazon stepped up and was delivering that. What we're here talking about today is not part of this program. This is disaster relief by Amazon. And this is, obviously AWS is part of the Amazon family, but we want to think, okay, so this is getting supplies and logistics and things to affected areas. We're drilling down a little bit further and saying, how can you actually execute a disaster response? How can you deliver capabilities to the affected areas faster? And so our program goals are to help improve the response organizations, their effectiveness. We don't want to get in their way. Rather, what we want to do and if I'm going to use some Andy Jassy words, is remove the undifferentiated heavy lifting that they have to do when it comes to technology. Using a technology in a specific way to give them a capability out in the field. Whether it's, making sure that they have acceptable imagery information to do early damage assessments. Are roads impassable? Is it possible that there are areas that have not been affected that were thought to be affected, and we should focus our attention on others? So you look at aerial and imagery information, things like that. So taking open data sets as an example. So what we want to be able to do is help those organizations really leverage technology to make their response even be more effective and more efficient. We also want to invest in deploying services. So as we go into these types of scenarios and we find out, well, that really works well. That not so much. So we really want to focus on making sure the stuff that works really well continues to work well and gets better. But more importantly, the things that kind of is a gap, doesn't really meet the need of the organizations or the entities that are responding to disasters, we need to figure out a way to help fill that gap. And that's part of the flywheel effect. It fits into the flywheel effect that Amazon really uses in the delivery of services and onboarding and scaling and building our infrastructure. From a training perspective, we're making a commitment to train our staff Not to necessarily, well, obviously it's not to deliver our services. They already know how to do that, but it's how to work with the humanitarian and relief organizations in the event of a disaster. So we want to make sure that there is trained staff within AWS that can actually help remove that undifferentiated heavy lifting for the organizations when they're out there and they've deployed. And frankly, we'd like to think, and I truly believe that Amazon is a force for good out there. There is times when we get dinged in the press for reasons I don't necessarily agree with. But when you look at it, we're always giving back to the communities, and we want to continue to amplify that and make sure that people understand that we're more than just a technology company, but we're all citizens. We're all part of the society. We want to give back and make sure people can recover from disasters. And so from a focus area, what we're looking at, as this is a new program inside of AWS, first we're making sure that we're building the team effectively. We're building it so that we can respond to the types of needs that the customers and organizations out there may have. We're also looking inward and saying, okay, if we look at open data sets, what type of information out there, as an example with open data sets, how can that information, if provisioned properly and made available to an organization in the event of a disaster, how can that actually make them more effective? And then we're also looking at how do we integrate native AWS services into this. We really like to think that we've got a lot to offer on this front, but the fact of the matter is it's not something that probably people think about when you're going into an area that has just been leveled by a Category 4 hurricane. The last thing you're thinking about is, how do I connect to the cloud? So from a roadmap, what we want to do is identify ways that we can help that community, help the first responders, help governments prepare, in high-risk areas. It's not always about the response. It's, there's a lot that has to be said about how you prepare to respond for pending danger. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of when. And so we want to be able to work with orgs and identify how we can uniquely help them. In terms of, innovation, we're looking at what we have and how can we reuse things, repurpose something that's been totally delivered for a different industry or different vertical. Our intention is to scale this program globally. Initially, we'll be launching, focusing mostly on the Americas initially, but I think very quickly we'll find that we have to scale this capability globally. And I think we'll really understand what that demand signal is with the first bullet point. As we start to engage and we continue to engage with organizations that are out there and finding out how can we help, it's really starting to scope and give us orders of magnitude of, wow, this could actually be a very big amount of help needed over here, and let's prepare for it. And so we want to collaborate, and we're working to collaborate with relief organizations that are actively involved in some of the biggest disasters we see about. Again, we're not there to get in their way. We are there to help them be better at what they need to do. Let's help them remove the things that they don't need to worry about. That's not their core competency. Their core competency is responding to the disaster, not worrying about how to actually manage an underlying infrastructure to deliver. And we want to actually engage our employees internally. Just this week, I've just amongst my peers and my extended network within Amazon, I was approached by several people and said, well, what's this talk you're doing on Thursday? What's that all about? And when I explained the program with them, immediately they're like, how do I get involved? I'd like to be interested. I'd like to sign up to be part of the team. Help me get connected with the right folks to do that. So from a disaster response team, let me talk about what it is. So I should have updated this slide because it's called a service to improve government responses. But really, I think it's more of a way of us for collecting services or stitching together a collection of services to help these organizations respond. And so what we want to do, especially from the the solutions architect perspective, is as we engage with these organizations and we understand what their business is, what is your business before a disaster strikes? What is your business during the disaster? Obviously, they're going to be different. And so how can we help you manage things during both time periods? Establishing playbooks, or tapping into established playbooks that these organizations have for delivering on the capabilities. Let us see where we can help you deliver the capability easier. We're going to be working with creating our own little volunteer force internally. And so our technical, we'll have a force of technical experts that are developers, infrastructure, networking folks that can be deployed and actually go out into the disaster area and try to help not only just deploy our capabilities, but if asked and called upon to do so, to help the local authorities that are trying to reestablish infrastructure and get things operating again. And we're willing to supply, send these groups of people out into the field. We're planning to do that for up to 2 weeks at a time. Doesn't mean you get 2 weeks and that's it. It just means it's probably a fresh set of faces that come through. But I put this out there to give you guys an indication as to what kind of commitment our employees are willing to sign up for. They're like, oh, so I'm going to go from staying in a hotel talking to a customer in this city to potentially 2 days later living in a tent. And believe it or not, there's a lot of people saying, sign me up, I'll do it, which is pretty refreshing. From a customer perspective, there's zero upfront costs to get started. Getting started really is a matter of let's engage and have the conversation. What is it that you do? What is your business? I talked about it before. Some relief organizations do things completely different than the other ones. So we can't, you don't just create some recipe and say, here, everybody go use it. So what we want to do is engage with these organizations in advance, out of season, if you would, if there is such a thing, and run through the playbooks and start to map and marry services to things that they need to do in the field to services that we have available. But I think what's more important is, as we're engaging with these customers, challenge them and say, take technology, communication, and all of those things off the table as a barrier for entry. If you could be king for a day, what would you do in a disaster scenario? And what would you need to do that? And let's start at the customer and work backwards. And I think what we'll find out, and we've begun to find out as we're engaging customers, is that, holy Moses, we didn't even think about that. There's a whole nother dimension here that we didn't even consider when we put this program together. And so I enjoy working with this because it seems like every other day, every other meeting, I'm having a reason to go talk to somebody in a different service team that I didn't even think about engaging with. So why are we doing it? Well, if you look at Amazon as in AWS, preparedness is key, right? Making sure you have the data, making sure you have the information you need to work with. Again, establishing the playbooks in advance of needing to respond is key here. Making that investment for the deployment of services. We think we have options here for you. As an organization that needs to respond, even if you're a government organization that needs to respond, we think we can help you get out and in front of these disasters. We're looking to leverage partnerships with the open data community. I think there's a lot of valuable data there. Question, it's almost like a matchmaking process. So how do we go through and get this matchmaking done? And I can't say the word philanthropic. Every time I do that, I say I'm going to do it, and I screw it up. Sorry. So philanthropic in nature, right? Like to give back. Definitely like to give back here. And there's no better reason to give back than when people are in dire straits. So the response level is going to be based on the severity of the incident. So again, going back to the whole playbook thing, what we want to do is engage with the organizations that want to use our services and start working through the playbooks and begin creating what is that response kit. Now, the response kit in terms of the technology. Perhaps there needs to be large open data sets that have to be made available in the field immediately. You're looking for mapping data, you're looking for imagery for before and after. You want to be able to compare maps. If you send a drone up after a disaster and it scans an entire city, and then you compare that to the before, and you can pretty quickly get a sense for how many buildings or how many structures have been wiped out. So we need customers to be onboarded before the response. I would love to think that somebody who hasn't onboarded can call us up and then we'll just scramble and we'll run out there. But the fact of the matter is if we're going to be effective and really do not create a blocker or create friction out in the field, we got to make sure that we pre-plan this. So in many cases, part of that planning is it's not just getting the customer ready, but it's the customer getting our teams ready. We need to understand how to behave in their operations. We can't get in their way. There's certain things you're allowed to do, certain things you can't do. So from an AWS perspective, we need to have our teams, our volunteers need to be invested in the training as well with the organizations that are looking to engage with. So onboarding in advance is key here. This one makes, it's the same point, right? Scope of work, you want to draft this before we get into a situation. We want to make sure we can provide maximum value for the efforts. So let's try to get ahead of this sooner than later. And once we do the assessment process, we'll determine of that rapid response team, that disaster response team of AWS professionals, of really who needs to be there. Maybe the organization we're engaging with, they're really strong in networking, and that's the first thing that they do when they get into the affected region, and they've got that covered. But they're like, hey, we've got this other thing that we need to have help with. So let's make sure we're properly aligning the resources. So I talked a little bit about this. How are we going to do this? So we're currently starting with at least 20 technical volunteers within the AWS family. These are folks from across different capabilities. The big ones are going to be infrastructure and networking, obviously. But these people also need to know that they're signing up for, you're going into some harsh conditions. We will take the time and make sure that they are certified in the incident management frameworks and accreditation certification, make sure they have first aid, CPR training. It's not just going there and hooking up networks. You're still a human. Somebody needs help, you help. And what's critical here is we want to look at, there's going to be a number of workloads we need to be able to run at the edge. And as you can, in the industry you see, there's more and more commitment from many players, third-party players within the industry around putting things out at the edge. They're cloud-based, but you can run them at the edge. And we want to make sure that these solutions are delivered to the heart at the disaster site and implement an infrastructure very rapidly based on what the customer need is. And so let's talk about the art of the possible. So I went through all of these slides, and I get into the pictures. I really like pictures because pictures, I think, say a lot more than anything I could ever say. So when the disaster strikes, what's next? You have to ask yourself, what's next for my organization? Now, we're talking governments here, we're talking communities, but it could be an enterprise, right? What I'm saying here doesn't necessarily have to be limited to nonprofits or cities or things like that. So one of the first things, this is a gross oversimplification, of course, right? But if you look at one of the first things that has to be done is reestablishing the core infrastructure. Now, obviously one of the first things you want to get running is the communications. But before we do that, what I have here on the screen is really meant to be an illustration of what I just spoke about in terms of let's run through the playbooks. Let's make sure that in advance of any disaster, we have everything in line and ready to go. And so we're a relief organization, may already have established infrastructure that they have up and running, and will continue to operate that. We can look for ways to be able to make it easier for them to operate that infrastructure. Secondly, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you'll notice that potentially you have a cloud-based solution that's standing at the ready, or maybe it's operational 100% of the time. I'll spend a little bit more time on that in a minute. So as you're establishing the core, the disaster has struck, the teams have deployed, one of the first things is to put together a base camp of operations and establish your medical stations. And so as the communications are coming together, what we're going to look at is a couple different things, is particularly in the case of hurricanes or high wind scenarios, if you lose the infrastructure and you lose towers, but there's likely going to be fiber available somewhere. So if you identify the fiber, can we tap into the fiber? Can we work with the telcos to get these long-haul networks running again? Is that even a possibility? Sometimes it might not even be a possibility. So if in that case, tap into that infrastructure. Perhaps maybe there are areas where cell service still works. So it's a matter of how do we work with those carriers to make sure that we can get access to the infrastructure to help enable the relief organization that needs to communicate phone home. And then we have satellite, of course. So looking for satellite is an option. So one of the things I talked about when I showed the VPC up there is, as part of a playbook, one of the things that, and I've worked with organizations in other verticals, verticals I'm sure represented by people in the room here. There exists the opportunity to stand up your infrastructure, whether it's an application ecosystem that has a database of user identities of people in an affected area, or perhaps it's the open data sets of imagery information. All of that information, it's great to have the data, but what do you do with it now that you've deployed it? And so one of the things that I'd like to look at is, when you think about the art of the possible, is build up that ecosystem inside of the cloud. Have it up and running. And what I'm clicking here is just showing just examples of some services that, if we actually were to deploy these services, we could probably take some or all of these to the edge and have what is running in the cloud actually show up on site. And so when we talk about the gold templates, the gold baselines, what I'm talking about is in advance of the disaster, as you're running through your playbooks, you can do training, you can do simulations, you do all of the things that you need to do to get your people that are going to be responding ready to go in advance of ever having to actually stand it up. And the thing about it is you can build it, you can create the AMI, you create the images, and then you turn it off. Don't spend the money if you don't need it. But as you guys identify additional technologies or new third-party partner technologies or things like that, spin up the environment, integrate the solution, test it, train, create the new gold baseline. Because what are we really looking to do here? What we want to have people do is when they show up on site, they're not worrying about, oh my goodness, there's a database I got to connect to, but this thing, I don't know if I'm going to connect to it. Do I have the right IP address schemes? They're worrying about things that they shouldn't be worried about. They should be worrying about the disaster. And so by doing this in the cloud, we really feel that we can cut down that learning curve, if you would, or that wasted time, if you would, that people were dealing with when they're getting out into disaster areas, because frankly, they're not focused on this. And so if we go back to the art of the possible and say, all right, so if we have the gold templates, what we'd like to be able to do is then take those out to the field and have them be deployed out into the infrastructure that it actually gets deployed out into the field. And so what we have here is a snowball edge at the bottom. We have mobile tablets, compute, with a laptop, could be handheld devices, whatever it is. And you basically take that AWS cloud infrastructure and make that available on your compute stack out at the edge. What that compute stack is, I don't know. That's up for discussion. However, but the idea here is that in our third-party ISV community, there are a lot of partners out there that allow you to take infrastructure that has been deployed on AWS and actually create portable images of these and deploy them out into other infrastructures. Again, this is meant to be art of the possible, not prescriptive. But to me, it looks like when we are preparing for a disaster and we know something's coming in and we've already run through for months the playbook and we've simulated the disasters and how we're going to use the technology and the data and perhaps even taking those simulations and use those to go back and enrich the data, because you're like, hey, you know what, if we had this other information, we could get even more. That's why those gold templates are critical. You get those templates established, now it's go time. Go time, deploy the templates, have them available out at the edge. And so if we look at Snowball, Snowball's been on the floor. If you're out on the floor, you probably saw a couple of them sitting in our booth. Snowball and Snowball Edge is, it's starting to take on a very big personality out in the cloud space. If we look at the different generations of Snowball, so there's the original Snowball, Snowball V1, which has 80 terabytes of storage and a 10 gigabit interface. It's a storage device. It's a giant storage device that's encrypted, ruggedized, and can handle the barge explosion test, which I think is so cool. I'd like to see that in person, by the way. So these devices have been in use now for several years, where people are actually taking very large amounts of data that they have on-prem or in some other location, and they need to be able to get it into the cloud. Sometimes having UPS or FedEx show up at your door is faster than what your pipeline, your network can handle going into the cloud. So that's where it started. And it quickly came back to customers are like, well, you know what, that's great. We really like to be able to, like having the ability to move a lot of data into the cloud, but we have other things that we need to do with that data while we're out on the edge. And so the use cases started to expand. At first, edge was one of the things that needed to be addressed with the Snowball Edge was that the first generation Snowball was, moving files could be a little slow. Not because you're putting it in a UPS truck, but like literally moving it off of your network and into the device, because you were really dependent on which machine you were using to actually do all the file encryption. So customers are like, okay, that's a little painful. So Snowball Edge has compute built into it. So with that compute, part of the tasking of that device is to actually do the encryption on the device, or as the data is flowing onto the device, offloading a lot of it from your source machine. And we've moved that up to 100 terabytes of capacity, increased network capabilities. There's actually 3 network interfaces in that device, so 10 gigabit, 25 gigabit, which shouldn't say 24, it should be 25, and 40. Encryption, same encryption, with keys that you, the customer, manage, and then it's ruggedized. This thing's 48 pounds. It can be dropped, survives the drop test, 8.5G, and it's portable. In fact, the one that we had at the booth, I carried on United Airlines on Monday morning. When I had 2 other bags, that became a little awkward, but I was able to do it. That's ruggedized. It's the shipping container. I literally took it to the counter, said, that's my bag, and they kind of looked at me, and I was like, that's my bag. They put the ribbon on it and went straight through. But that's important when we're talking about putting these things out at the edge. Obviously, if you're in the middle of a disaster, you're in inhospitable environments. The device is ruggedized. It's ready to deal with those scenarios. And then we talk about real big data is a snowmobile. Yeah. If you've got impassable roads, this one might not be an option. But I just put it up here as kind of the evolution of the product, right? So we get into where this service, the snowmobile service, a lot of people are interested in it. A lot of people from a lot around the world. And so again, the reason why I put this up here is this is not meant to be a snowball pitch, but what it is to say, wow, as we had these technologies, it started as one thing, which was just help me move my data, and began to quickly take on a personality of and of itself, and we found out that, oh my goodness, this thing can do a lot. And so when you look at some of the other services that are now made available on a Snowball Edge, you can run file services. So you have the Snowball Edge, you connect it to your network, you have the ability to use NFS, and you can do an NFS mount. So think about that. You have laptops or you have whatever, they need to have access to very large files, and they need low latency, high bandwidth connections, even out in the field. We can now start to support that kind of stuff. So you have access to that data. You have Greengrass and Lambda that can run at the edge. So now, as you're receiving data in, you can actually start to act on that data. Again, because you've gone through the playbook and you've done the pre-planning and you already know that you have some things that you're going to be looking for. Maybe there's some interesting data points that you may want to find. Well, if you start running some imagery analysis in the network, whether it's through a deep lens or something along that lines, and you start to get interesting information that's coming in even from video or from photographs, you have Lambda that's starting to act on that. So all of a sudden the ecosystem, that slow-moving wheel is starting to gain a little more momentum. And I'm really excited to see where this is going because there's a lot more things to come on this front. And so if we go back to our disaster area and we say, okay, we've now established comms, We have a portable data center or compute capacity, call it what you want to call it. What about the affected areas? That's great. What are people going to do? Collect information and then run back to a tent, download it, and look for something. Like, no, we want to be able to reach out into the affected areas. And so working with mesh technologies, the mesh technologies are growing at a very fast rate right now. And the strength and the things that they can do with these technologies. So one of the things we're looking at is looking at a way to implement a mesh technology. So everywhere you put a POP, you extend the network that much farther. And so we don't know, we're not going to know what the affected areas are until we get there. We start doing some initial damage assessments. This is where our partners in the drone industry are really kind of gravitating to this kind of offering because they bring a lot to the table. Boom, I could throw a drone up there and surveil an environment and gather the necessary reconnaissance within hours or minutes to be able to determine if roads are impassable, if there are fires, if there's down power lines in certain areas, things like that, and actually feed that back into the system. Again, having the playbook defined and said, remember I talked about if I were king for a day, what would I do? Well, that's why we want the customers to think like that. Best case scenario, you have access to all the technology in the world at the edge. What would you do with it? And so as our team engaged with customers and we continue to iterate through that, what we found is that we're just scratching the surface here. Because think about scenarios where, as an example here, your medical stations are connected. So say you're using Deep Lens, you deploy Deep Lens out at the edge in some affected areas because you're trying to get a sense for, are there people passing through areas or people seeking help or things like that, and you're capturing the imagery information. Now, what if you were able to actually take some of the imagery that's captured there and reunite a family that's been separated? Or somebody who's been separated from their child is looking for their child and goes to a camp or an operator, and an operator pulls up a tablet and says, your child's at the medical station getting tended to. They were found in this location. That's kind of the art of the possible that we want to look at. This is not about databases. This is not about just putting map stuff up. This is about how are we going to affect people's lives faster in a positive way. And so that's what we want to do. We want to reach out to you, the customers, and say, we're putting up a program to do this. Come to us and tell us how you need help, because we're willing to invest the resources, the money, the technology to do this. I'm excited at the possibilities here. And so a couple other conversations that we're looking to have with customers. At the bottom of the screen on the right-hand side, you have your governments, your local governments. Continuity of government can be very important, especially in island areas. You've completely lost your infrastructure, your police forces, whatever it may be. They need to be able to communicate. And granted, many of them already have their emergency communications infrastructure that they deploy. But what about the citizens? The citizens are going to want to be able to communicate with the civic authorities. Maybe they need additional information. Guess what? We're getting areas that are being wiped out by hurricanes that are pretty developed, and chances are many of the people there have cell phones. And they're like, well, the cell phone doesn't work because the towers are gone. Or are they? There's an opportunity there that maybe we can create a capability that cell service can be restored, at least in an ad hoc fashion, enough that we can actually leverage the population of the affected area to crowdsource data. And so now you start crowdsourcing from people's cell phones, or you give them an open Wi-Fi, because remember, we have a mesh network out there, so why can't we just open that mesh up and say, connect your smartphone to this mesh, and you can start to communicate, hey, I need help, or somebody needs help, or you know what, this bridge is washed out, don't come this way. Get the community involved in this. And so we want to engage also the government authorities in these areas and say, we understand you guys have a big, tall task here. If we can help you be better at your job and take a lot of the heavy lifting off, let's get the community to buy into this. Let's get them to help feel like they have ownership in the emergency response as well. And so we look at that, and that's a flywheel that extends beyond just the actual disaster, and it starts to bleed over into the response and recovery. If you're going to recover in an affected area, Seems to me like it would be a heck of a lot easier to recover when your community's already bought into it. And how did they get bought into it? Well, they were bought into it because they helped during the response. Maybe I'm just being too, loosey-goosey about this, but I like to think that if I have skin in the game, I talk to my kids all the time, I can help you do things, but you need to have skin in the game and own it. And I think having the community own the response is how you have a quicker recovery. And so I talked a little bit about deep lens. I mean, like, how would you use deep lens in this environment? So you have models. You want to do deep learning models. There are specific things that you may want to do. You train it during the period of which you're building your gold templates. Come up with whatever that is. If it's a database of identities, driver's licenses as an example, that you're trying to identify people, great. If that's too sensitive, you don't want to do that, what is that thing you're looking for? Train it. Train the model in the cloud. Then you deploy it to the deep lenses. The deep lenses get deployed out into the disaster area. The information that it's collecting flows back through the mesh and is delivered to the Snowball edge, where you can have Lambda executing code against that, or you can actually have other compute resources that are running workloads against that data. So you immediately can start to consume it. And then when you consume that, you can consume it through things like a Jupyter, where you're actually doing both the analytics and the display. Insert whatever capability you want there. But the key here is the timeliness to be able to respond and act on the data. It's one thing to collect the data. That's great. We've collected a lot of data. What do we do with it? Well, because we pre-planned and we engaged and we put the playbook together, we knew that when we receive data, we're going to be looking for A, B, and C. And when we find A, we're going to do this. When we find B, we're going to do that. And these are things that we want the customers, as part of their pre-planning, to have made available in this infrastructure. Taking drone imagery as an example. Here's an example from Drone Deploy. Some maps that they have actually created flying over effective disaster areas. Using the open data, you actually take before images, compare them to the after, or actually in reverse, right? You take the after, compare it to the before, and identify the disaster, what the affected area is. If you look on the left here, or actually on the right, you've got burned out buildings, gone from wildfires. Let's just say that was an after image of the picture on the right. You end up with piles of rubble because you had earthquakes or things were blown down from hurricanes. When you're comparing it to the before, you can actually identify the structures and say, oh yeah, this structure was an elementary school. This structure is a hospital. This structure is, it's a housing complex. And really help to prioritize your triage and your response. So with that, I've been talking a lot. What I would like to do is engage and challenge all of you. Take a look at our site. Take a look at the information that we have here. We want to hear from you. We want to hear from the community. We're willing and ready to engage. Maggie Carter down here, she's running the program. And she's probably yelling at me right now under her breath because her inbox is going to get flooded, I hope. If I did my job, you'll get a bunch of email. But no, we're really looking forward to working with organizations. In fact, the team we've already started, we're engaged with a couple of relief organizations already. Myself and a couple of colleagues, we're actually going out for training in the next month or so. And we're going to continue to look at ways to take our services and field test them. Put them out in the field and say, wow, this thing is awful. That was a bad idea. Why would you do that? And figure out, let's fix it before we actually really need this thing. So looking forward to that. If you could please complete the surveys, I would very much appreciate it. I'm going to wrap a little bit early because we've got a party to go to. And I appreciate everybody's time. And if anybody has any questions, I'll make myself available here up front. Thank you.